Hey there. I'm making this video to explain something that I've been banging my head against for about the last day. I was on the VRChat forums and Splinks asked a question about his world, and he has a set of pens in his world, and he asked, is there a trigger setup or another method in the SDK that will teleport the pens back to their original spawning point after they leave an area? I was curious about this myself because I need to have pickups respawn in my world as well, and couldn't really find much information on this. So I tried a bunch of different things, and the solution I came up with isn't perfect, but it's serviceable. So I'm going to show what I did to get to that point and how it works, and hopefully it'll help you out. So I'm here in my test world, and I'm going to start by plopping down an object. This is what we're going to use as a pickup object. It's not a pen, but it should hopefully be the same idea. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn this into a pickup object. This is just a model right now. You can't interact with it. And so I'm going to do that by adding a collider at first. I recommend using a box collider whenever you can, because it's much simpler and it takes less processing power to actually detect the collisions with it. But with more complex objects like this mug that has a little handle, I'm gonna choose a mesh collider. You want to set that to convex, and if your model's really small or just weird in some ways, if it's acting weird, you may need to inflate the mesh, which will make it a little bit bigger than it usually is. But I don't need to do that here, so I'm going to turn that off. Yeah, so add a collider, and I need to add a pickup, a VRC pickup, which will add a rigid body to it. And that should all be good. And I'm also going to add a VRC sync object or object sync, and that'll prevent a lot of issues, as well as syncing the object across all players if I were to theoretically upload this world. Cool. So now this coffee mug will be able to be picked up by the player and move around and thrown and all that. I'm gonna make this a prefab, so I'm gonna actually name this to coffee mug test pickup, and make it a prefab by dragging it into my project. And what a prefab is, if you don't know, in Unity, you can create a prefab, which is basically like a cookie cutter object. And you can take that prefab and make as many instances of it as you'd like in your scene. And you can then change the prefab. So let's say we wanted the mass to be a little bit higher on all of these objects. I can set that to 3 or whatever I want, and hit apply, and then it'll apply it across the board to all my other prefabs. This isn't necessary if you're just using one unique object in your world, but it might be nice anyway to stay organized. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. That's what I do with all my pickup objects, so I'm not editing the original model directly. But yeah, so now if I were to build this world, I would be able to go in here and pick up this mug. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do a handful of builds along the way, but just trust me that you can pick up this mug now. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a cube in the world that we're going to use as a trigger to test with. So I'm going to add a cube, and we'll bring it over here a little bit. And I'm also going to make it a little bit smaller. I'm going to make the material on it a little bit different, so I can tell it's a trigger. I use this for all my triggers, and then when I actually do a build, I just turn off the mesh renderer so it doesn't show up. And the most important part is we need to set this as a trigger. Right now, without that checked, it's a collider, so you would be able to actually run into it, and we don't want that. We only want it to detect things, not actually collide with things. So we'll turn that trigger on, and the last thing we're going to do is we're going to set a layer for this. Now you can keep it on the default layer like it is right now, if you're not going to use triggers like this for anything else. But I still recommend adding your own layer to keep things organized. So to create your own layer, you go to this here in the inspector or up here, and you go to add layer. Now, if you haven't made a build of your world yet, I would recommend just doing that immediately, because there are some initial steps you need to do with VRChat world building that will set up layers that it needs to use automatically. And I believe if you were to go in here and add your own layers before you do that, it would just erase all those layers and basically mess everything up. So you don't want that. So set that up, and then after you've done that, you'll have all these layers here up to layer 21, and then you can add your own layer down here. So what I did is I added a layer called destroy object, because in my world I'm not respawning objects, I'm just destroying them. But we can use that layer for this anyway. So name it whatever you like, whatever makes sense to you, and then go back to your object and set that layer. Cool. So now we have a trigger that is on our own trigger layer that we need to use. We've set it as a trigger, and I've just set a material for it to distinguish it better from other objects. I'm also going to change the name to trigger. This isn't necessary either. It's just for organization. Okay, cool. So we have our trigger, and we won't need to mess with that at all ever. We are going to have all our trigger functionality on our object itself. So let's start to do that. What we're going to do is go to our object. So in this case, my coffee mug. In your case, it might be a pen or whatever. And I'm going to add a component of a VRC Trigger. And what a VRC Trigger does is, well, it does a lot of things, but basically it detects one thing and responds to it with an action. It's pretty limited in scope, which is why I've had such difficulty getting this done. But it's how you do things like that. So we added a trigger, and we're going to go down here and choose a trigger type. What we want is on enter trigger, and what that does is it will trigger an action whenever this object, the collider on this object, interacts with any other trigger. So when it goes inside this trigger here, it'll say, hey, do this thing. To be able to make sure we're doing that, though, we are going to set the layer of the on enter trigger to our destroy object layer. Once again, if you're on default, you can set it to default. And if you want any trigger to do it, you can set it to everything. But I don't want everything. I want destroy object. And one more thing is, like, if you wanted to have it on multiple layers, you can do that too. But once again, I don't want that. So we have it on our destroy object layer, and we're going to add an action to it. So far what we've done is said, hey, this is what's going to trigger our action, and now we're setting that exact action. So we're going to go to basic events, and we're going to choose a destroy object event. This is just for testing purposes. This isn't what we want in the end, but we're just going to test out and see how this works. So we're going to go to our destroy object action and add a receiver. This is the object that is going to receive the destroying, basically. And that, what we want to do is just set it to the object itself, so our coffee mug itself. And now, whenever it enters this trigger or any trigger on that layer, it will then just delete itself. So we're going to hit apply, and I'm going to just duplicate this and just have a few sitting out here so I can have multiple to test with. You can duplicate by hitting Control D. So yeah, I'm gonna start a build now, and that'll take just a minute. So while that's building, I'm gonna switch over to my other monitor, which is blank right now, and I'm gonna just briefly go over what we've done so far. So we have got a model or an object or whatever it is that we want. We've placed it in the world and we've turned it into a pickup object, which means we can pick it up. Then we added a trigger into the world that we can then use to as like a collision detection to trigger something else. It's wide open. It can trigger pretty much anything. We then added a trigger to our object, our pickup object, that says, hey, when we enter this trigger, delete ourselves. So now we're in the world and we're gonna see we can pick up this object, we can drop it, pick it up again if you really want to. And theoretically, once I touch this, once this object interacts with that trigger right there, it will delete itself. So let's go ahead and just do that. Bam, it's gone. It's gone forever. And I can do that with all these. They just all are dying right before our eyes. There we go. So that works. So we can get it to delete itself, which isn't what we want, but it's a nice way to test to see if our trigger is working. So what we really want to do though is we want it to go back to a set respawn point. We want it to go back to where it started, not delete itself, because we want the object to stay. We just don't want it to go into that trigger. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to remove this destroy object action and replace it with what's called a teleport to action. And you want to go to events from scene in the actions and then find your object. It's important to find the object you're actually editing because once you apply the prefab, it may mess up. And we're going to choose teleport to. And then we're going to select that action. And you'll see the receiver is still this, but if it's not there, you just drag your object back onto the receiver. And we need a target location. Now this is just an object that it is going to teleport to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the object itself and create an empty game object. And that'll make it as a child of this game object centered at its root. And that's the only reason I made it that way. Now I'm going to drag it out so it's not a child, but it still retains its position. And I'm going to move it up a bit. Another thing I'm going to do is go up here and add a icon so I can see it in the scene view. It doesn't really matter because we know it's there, but it's helpful for editing to see where things are going. And finally, I'm just going to rename this to respawn point. By the way, to rename things in Unity, you select them and press F2 on your keyboard. Another way is with game objects is you just go up here and edit the name up there. But yeah, so now we have that respawn point. Let's go back to this trigger and we're going to drag that respawn point into the target location. And now when we hit apply, it'll change all our objects to do that. And we're going to do another test build. We're going to see what this does. So this is building now. And quickly, I'm going to explain what we've done so far. And that is we have changed our trigger on our pickup object, which previously destroyed it upon entering our box trigger. We are changing that to teleport it back to spawn or to a designated spawn point. It's not exactly where it started at spawn, but you could set that spawn point where you place the mug and it would be fine. So let's get in here and test that out. So what we expect to happen here, once again, this is, can pick it up and drop it, everything's working. What we expect to happen here is similar to what we did before. We're going to touch this box and it's going to teleport right back over there. Instead of deleting itself like it did before. So I'm gonna go ahead and touch it now, and you'll notice it's still here. It didn't seem to go back at all. So what's happening here? Well, the way that VRChat handles picking up objects is basically when you're holding an object, it is just constantly, every time the server updates, it is teleporting that object back to your hand. So if I go over here and put my camera just right, you might see some flickers when this enters of the mug being over there for like a frame before it then teleports back to my hand. And it's also worth noting that on enter trigger only works when, as it says, when this enters a trigger or a trigger enters it. So when I do this, I've done it, like it enters the trigger and it triggers once, but once it's inside the trigger, until it completely leaves, it's not doing that trigger again. So it's not constantly trying to teleport this back. So if I just drop this while it's in here, it's already tried to teleport it back once. It's not going to do it again because it's nothing is causing that to leave. And just to show that it is, in fact, because I'm holding the object, that it's not teleporting back, I can throw this in here and it'll do it. It'll teleport back just fine because I'm not holding it anymore. So it's not constantly teleporting back to my hand. I can do this for all these. Cool. So that almost works, but we really don't want people to bring their object, into this trigger. We want it so once it touches this trigger, they are not able to hold this object. And I will explain, like, the difficulty of that is I don't actually know how to remove the object from their hands, because the solution is, or would be, is once it enters, you would remove it from their hand and then teleport it. That way it's not teleporting back their hand. But through all my testing, I could not find an exact way to do that. So if you know how to do that in the SDK, that's the solution. The solution is to go in here and before doing this teleport, you add whatever it is that takes the object from the player. I thought that it might be a take ownership or reap object. Those didn't seem to work for me, but you might want to mess around with that before trying what I'm doing. So the way that I did it is and it's going to get a little bit more complex, but I then created an empty game object as a child of the model. So I'm going to name this game object respawn timer. And we're going to add a trigger to this as well. So we're going to add a VRC trigger and we're going to go to on timer. And what on timer does is you set a certain amount of time and let's say it's 5 seconds. At the end of that 5 seconds, it is going to then do the action that you specify. So it's going to wait 5 seconds and then do that action. By setting repeat on this, it will wait 5 seconds, do the action that you want, and then start the timer over, and then 5 seconds later, it'll do the action again, and it'll do that endlessly. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to do reset on enable, which means that the timer will not start until you enable the game object, and then once it's enabled, the timer will start from 0, count up to 5 or whatever time you have it set for, and then do that action. So we have this respawn timer, and we're gonna this is in seconds, so we're gonna set this to half a second right now. We'll change this later, but we're gonna set half a second to make sure this is working, and we're gonna set the same action as we did previously with the teleport to. So go to events from scene. Find your object, teleport to, and then once again we have to drag our respawn point in here. And we're gonna want to set, so as now, if I were to press play, or if I were to build the scene, this would be on and just constantly repeating every half second, the object would teleport back. So we want to turn this off so that that timer is not running. And then what we want to do is we want to go to our on enter trigger over here, remove this teleport to because the timer's taking care of that. And we're going to add a basic event, and that is set game object active. And what set game object active is kind of what it sounds like. It will enable or disable a game object based on the condition that you give it. So we're gonna click on that. We're gonna add a receiver. We're gonna set the respawn timer as a receiver. We're gonna set the operation to true. So what this says is on trigger enter. So upon entering this trigger, we are gonna set this respawn timer to active. And then once this respawn timer is active, every half a second, it's going to try to teleport back. So we'll set that back to inactive by default. But we need to do one more thing, and that is we are going to add an on exit trigger, which is somewhere in here, right here. Okay, on exit trigger, add, and it should take all the settings from your on enter trigger. So all we need to change here is the operation to false. And what that will do is make it so when it exits the trigger, it will turn this respawn timer off. So what's going to happen here is this respawn timer is going to be off by default. So the mug will be sitting here, and it will not be doing anything. It'll just be sitting there. And then once you pick it up and bring it into this trigger, this respawn timer will turn on. And then every half second, it's going to try to teleport this object back. And then, like, that's that. It's still going to act the way it was when we entered the collider before, where it's going to teleport back briefly, but if you're still holding it, it'll teleport back to your hand. But once you drop it, it will then not be constrained by you holding it, and it will teleport back to spawn. Another thing you can do is if you're holding it in here, it'll be trying to respawn over and over and over. But if you're still holding it and then bring it out, this on exit trigger will happen, and it will turn this respawn timer back off, and it will stop trying to respawn. The nice thing is, once you drop it inside this cube and it teleports back, that counts as an exit trigger because it is literally just moving back to position. So that also counts as an exit trigger, and it will also turn off that respawn timer. So we don't need to do anything special there. So I'm going to apply this so you can see how it looks. All right. While it's building, briefly, going to explain again. What's happening here is we have a respawn timer trigger, or we have an entire game object dedicated to a respawn timer trigger. When we enable that game object, the object will try to respawn itself every half of a second. When we disable it, it will not try to do that. So it should be building here. Yeah, it's going to load up in just a second. Okay, so we're going to pick up our object and we're going to bring it in here. And as you can see, it is every half a second, and hopefully you can see it flickering. Every half a second, it is trying to teleport back to spawn. We're holding it so it can't. You can see it's doing this annoying flicker while it tries to go back to spawn. But if we drop the object in here, you see within half a second, it does in fact respawn. So that's nice. It can't go out of this area. It can't go into this trigger and then have it be let go. Like someone can't let go of it and then it just stay there like previously. So that solves that problem. But it's pretty annoying as is, because it's just flickering and that just doesn't look right. So we're gonna go ahead and fix that now. And the simple way that I found to fix that is go to your VRChat world and find your update time. This is how frequently your world will update. So right now it's set to 10, so every 10 milliseconds, the server will sync all its variables to all clients. So when you're holding an object, every 10 seconds it is teleporting that object, or 10 milliseconds it is teleporting your object back to your hand. So what we're going to do then is we're going to go to our timer, and we're going to set this timer to 10 milliseconds. And keep in mind this is set in seconds, so you have to do a little bit of math, but it's not hard. So 10 milliseconds is 0.01 seconds. So go there, we'll apply that, and we'll just do another quick build so you can see how that looks. Again, it is building here. It just takes a moment, and I don't really have much to explain here. We've just updated the amount of time that the respawn timer is going on. So instead of every half second it trying to respawn, it's now every 10th of a second, or 100. It's 10 milliseconds. So that much. So we're gonna pick this up and we're gonna bring it in here, and you'll see now it's doing something a little bit different. It's not flickering, because every time the game updates, it's bringing it back to our hand and then bringing it back to spawn. So as soon as it hits our hand, it's like, no, I want to be at spawn. But it is just floating there. But because we're technically still holding, like you can see my hand, it's technically still in my hand, but it's moving its position back so quickly that we can't see it. And this is kind of the best that you're gonna get with this kind of thing. A thing you could do is here, let me just make sure these are all working. Yeah. So once you let go, it will instantly respawn, which is a much nicer thing. This does take more processing power, so if you're okay with the flickering business, I recommend doing that, but this shouldn't be too hard if you don't have it going on too many objects. But yeah, so a thing you could do to make it look a little bit nicer maybe is you could go in here to the respawn timer trigger, and you could add a basic event and choose set component active. And the set component active can then go in here and choose the mesh renderer and just turn the mesh renderer off, so it won't render the object, so it won't be like, there's a floating thing, but you're still technically holding it. I'm not going to do that because it might be weird, and I don't really mind that it's floating there. The point is, we don't want people to be using these objects beyond a certain point, which I'm going to explain now. All we've done so far is make it so you can't bring it into this box, but in reality that's actually all you need to do. And then what you can do is take one of these boxes and put it around the area that you want. So let's say like this little area is what we want to block off. So we'll take our box and we will move it in such a way that we create a nice wall, and we'll do that, rotate it, bring it over here. Actually, we're going to bring it this way a bit so those don't respawn instantly. About there should be good. And I'm hitting T here, which is the thing up here, to be able to drag it like this. Right? I'll take that, bring it over here, and then bring it this way. And now we have a nice little box. You can make a ceiling and a floor as well, which I would recommend doing, because people can throw objects, but even if your object can't move, like it doesn't have gravity or anything like that, it doesn't have physics, people can still put things above or below. And let's just real quick see how that looks. So I'm doing a new build now. And the thing we've done is added more triggers to create a box around our area. Okay, cool. So you can see we have a box now. It's actually quite bright. And if we bring one of these in here or out of our main area, it'll try to respawn. But the problem with this is we're still carrying this object, so we can, unless you make these boxes extend everywhere in your world except for your area, you can go right past it and you'll be holding the object again, which is maybe what you want. This is like an exclusionary method of doing things. So if you want to make it so you can't bring objects into an area, but they can be anywhere else, and you just want to exclude areas to have these objects, this is a great way to do it. But we're going to try a different method of doing this, because we want it to not leave an area instead of not being able to enter an area, if that makes sense. So I'm going to delete these walls, and I'm going to extend this out. Oh, not that way. Extend this out so it's covering the area that we want things not to leave. And then what I'm going to do is go to my triggers here, and we're going to change our onEnter trigger to well, actually we're going to change it to something else, because our onExit trigger is being used. So we're going to just change it to onExit collider real quick, and we're going to change this onExit trigger to onEnter trigger. And now that the onEnter trigger is freed up, we're going to change this to onExit trigger. So basically what we did is we swapped the two. So what will happen now is, upon entering the trigger, it starts inside the trigger, and upon entering it, it will do nothing. It'll be like we just started. It won't try to respawn, but then once it tries to leave the area, then it will trigger the respawning timer. So we're going to delete this so it doesn't mess anything up. We're going to go here, we're going to apply this, and we're going to test that out. So once again, doing a build here, and to reiterate, all we're doing is the same exact thing we've been doing this entire time, except we're going to make it so instead of when our object is interacting with the trigger initially, so it first enters the trigger, it's trying to respawn, we're going to make it so when it exits that trigger. So this is great for if you have a single room you want these things in, and you don't want them to exit. So you'll see we're in the trigger right now, but it's not trying to respawn. But if I move out here, you'll see that it does not want to leave. Once again, we're still holding this object, and you see it does act really buggy, but this is a good solution because you can't use the object properly when it's like this. Once again, you could do things like set the mesh renderer to be invisible so it doesn't flicker like this and all that, but that is doing what it needs to. And I believe that may have done something weird with the respawn. Yeah, it fell down there because I moved a little bit when I let go of it. But yeah, so that's decently effective. I'd say that's somewhat acceptable for what we want. And you could stop here if all you wanted was your objects to respawn in such a manner. A way you could change this as is you could set this spawn point to have a trigger that then spawns an object, what you would do, actually you would make it a custom trigger. That's right, you would make it a custom trigger, and then you can make it spawn object, and then you would drag your prefab in here, and then choose the respawn point as a location. And then you would go in here and do an on enter trigger or on extra trigger, whichever you're using, and do a basic event, and then should be activate custom trigger. And then you'd go in and select this trigger and do all that. But we don't want to do that with this, because with pens, I believe that the object needs to oh yeah, so sorry, let me move that back up again. On the thing, you would activate this custom trigger, and then right after that you would do a destroy object and delete itself. So basically it would spawn a new object and then delete the one you're holding, and that would remove it from your hand, but it would delete the object as well. And I believe with pens, you need to keep that object alive in order for the trails to stay. But if not, then that's the better way to go about it. But yeah, so if you just need a simple object, and either of the two methods that I've just mentioned will work. But there's a little bit more that I think you need to do with pens. I don't actually know. I've not messed with pens in VRChat, but I believe the way pens work is with a particle system, or maybe a trail renderer. So real quick, I'm gonna turn these mugs into pens, which is weird, but yeah, I'm gonna do that. And I don't know if this is how it works. So if this isn't how it works, just ignore me, and just move on. But there may be a problem with the way pens work with the teleporting back, because what a teleport does is it just goes from one position to another, just really quickly. But the way I believe pens work is you have these particles, and let me change the size and the speed to something a little bit more palatable, and the shape. I believe the way pens work is when you're clicking them down, they are emitting particles, or you do it over distance, or rather it's a combination of the two. So it'll only emit particles when the thing's moving and you're clicking down. So why is that not working? Oh, right, I need to set this to world space. Sorry about that. So yeah, so when you're moving the pen, it will make things, particles in between those points based on how far it goes. So I believe if you were to do a teleport from here, it would just teleport all the way back and leave that nasty trail, and you don't want that. So we're gonna do a couple things, but let me first get this set up so it looks like a nice pen. So set the max particles pretty high. Do that. Let's change the particle shape. We'll change the color over lifetime as well to something a little bit prettier. Yeah, that's nice. That's even higher, so it does more. And we'll change the lifetime to something much higher, so it's more like drawing. Cool. So that's our particle system. It doesn't actually look like a pen, but you know, it will emulate it for us. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to go to our trigger once again, and what we need to do is we need to make it, well, first of all, we need to turn this to a pen. We're still working on that. So we're going to change auto hold to yes, which will make it so you equip the item instead of having to hold down the click to hold it. And we are going to add a couple of triggers to to turn those particles on and off as we use it. So we need to use on pickup use down, which is when you hold down the mouse when you have something equipped. We're going to remove the set game object to active, and we're going to choose a set particle playing. And we're just going to set the receiver to our particle system. And we're going to set that to true. So when you would click down, it's going to be true. True. I can speak. We're going to add a on pickup use up, which is when you let go of the mouse. We're going to set this particle playing to false. And we're going to add a on enable, which will happen when the object spawns. And we're going to make that also false, so it doesn't start from the beginning. Cool, so that should have made our pen. And theoretically, that may actually work. The only issue that might happen is you'll bring your object over here, and it might just constantly be making trails, or it will be constantly making particles at spawn. So we're gonna just bring that back here, and we're going to just make extra sure that it's not making particles. So we're gonna go to our on exit trigger, which will try to start respawning it. And we're going to add another action that is once again just turning those particles off. So set particle playing and set that to our change our receiver and set that to false. And that should work as it is. If it still is giving issues, I would go to the respawn timer and change this to add the set particle playing to false. I don't think that's going to be necessary though. And I'm just going to do one more thing that I mentioned earlier that I might as well do, and I'm going to set the on exit trigger and I'm going to choose basic events, set component active, choose our model, and the mesh render is what we want. We're going to set that to false, and then we're going to do the same on enter trigger, except we're going to set it true. So basic events, set component active, receivers, object itself, mesh renderer, true. We're going to apply this and hope it works. I've not done too much testing on this, but this should function the way we want it. So one last test build here. Hopefully one last. If there's an issue, of course, I'll build more. But it's been a little bit of time explaining all this. And yeah, so let's just explain one more time. What we did is we turned it into a pen. I don't know if I'm doing the right way of making a pen, but we're making a pen by doing a particle system that is emitting when we're clicking down. We then made it so when the object exits the trigger or we're not clicking, we made it so it stops the particle system. So let's go ahead and pick this up. So now we can equip it. So now we're just equipping this. If I click down, yeah, you see that I can now make trails. They're very, very pretty. And if I go out, the object disappears, and you'll see, well, you can't really see it because of how bright my trigger is. But because we're turning the mesh renderer off when we exit, it's not showing up at spawn. So theoretically, I should be able to click down, and it's not making any trails where they shouldn't be. So I can go ahead and hold down, click, make some trails, and then once I exit, it's not making trails, but I'm still holding down, click, and it doesn't work when we enter, but I can click again and it'll work. So that'll just disable it once we exit. And even though we're still holding the object, which isn't ideal, and once again, if there's a way to get rid of the object, a lot of this that I've explained isn't necessary, but this should effectively work for what you want it for. You don't want people taking your pens or whatever object out of this area. Pens specifically, because you don't want people drawing out of a certain area. So you're setting it up. So once they exit this trigger, the object is constantly trying to teleport back, and you're not allowing any more particles to spawn. If you're using a trail renderer to make pens, there may be something similar there, but I don't know if there's a set trail rendering on. All I know is the particle system one. So yeah, that's that. I can go back to Unity real quick and just do a brief overview, if that would help. But basically, from the top, what we did is we made a pickup object. That's pretty simple. You basically just add all the stuff to make it so you can pick it up. Then what we did is we made a trigger. And the way we made this trigger is we made the collider a trigger by using this checkbox. And once again, you can use anything but a box collider or anything other than a box collider as well. But we made a cube, and that's the simplest way to do collision, so we kept that on. And once I can turn this mesh render off, and it'll be better once you're in game, because you won't see this big ugly mess. And then what we did with our trigger is we set it to its own layer, so we can only check for collisions on that layer, so we don't have other things accidentally messing it up. Then we added a trigger script to our pickup object. Our trigger script then checks for when we exit the trigger, and upon exiting the trigger, we set a timer we made to turn on. This timer repeats constantly until it then enters the trigger again, which we also have set in here. And yeah, that's it. With the particles, we just made sure that when you exit the trigger, the particles turn off, and as well as when you let go of the button, the particles turn off. And yeah, I think that's it. I'm sorry if that was a bit much. It did take nearly an hour to explain, but I tried to be as thorough as possible. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask. And one more thing I would like to reiterate again is the most clean way of doing this would be to make a spawn point that has a custom script to respawn an object and just delete the object once it exits here. But with pens, it's really complicated, and that's why we went all through this stuff. It's not perfect. But yeah, if you have a way, if you know of a way with the SDK, which I'm sure it's possible, and I just haven't done it right. If you know of a way to remove the object from a player's hand without deleting it, I would love to know that. Yeah, that's it. Best of luck. Hopefully this helped you. Hopefully it wasn't a 50-minute waste of your time. Yeah, good luck with your world. Can't wait to see it. See ya.